And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Alice Coltrane, her life and times and best hits. So Alice Coltrane was a very unique musician. She was the wife of the jazz legend John Coltrane, and if anything, her music was even more innovative than his. She carved a special sonic style for herself in the post-bop world of the 50s and 60s when she rose to stardom. Her styles on piano, organ and harp were unique at the time. Also her compositional styles, which drew inspiration from blues themes and spiritual themes. Songs like Journey in Satchidananda, Blue Nile and Lovely Skyboat. Her musical style was a blend of African American, Indian and spiritual music. She started out in John Coltrane's quartet, known as the classic quartet at the time in the 50s. After the death of her husband, she embarked on a spiritual journey to cope with her grief, and that theme was apparent in many of her later albums. She was one of the founders of the spiritual jazz genre, and her works inspired generations of musicians to come. In the 70s, she became engrossed in spiritual education. She founded 2 ashrams or Vedic spiritual training centers in the 70s and took up position as spiritual guru. In the 90s, she released several albums of Hindu spiritual songs and returned to spiritual jazz in the 2000s. Some of her best albums include Universal Consciousness, World Galaxy, Lord of Lords, Illuminations, Eternity and more. So that was a bit of insight into Alice Coltrane, her life and times and best hits. More details coming up. Also coming up, some trending festival and album news. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva to find out more. We'll be right back after some music. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Alice Coltrane, her life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about her biography. So Alice Coltrane was a very unique musician. She was the wife of the jazz legend John Coltrane, and if anything, her music was even more innovative than his. She carved a special sonic style for herself in the post-bop world of the 50s and 60s when she rose to stardom. Her styles on piano, organ and harp were unique at the time. Also her compositional styles, which drew inspiration from blues themes and spiritual themes. Songs like Journey in Satchidananda, Blue Nile and Lovely Skyboat. Her musical style was a blend of African American, Indian and spiritual Vedic music. She started out in John Coltrane's quartet, known as the classic quartet at the time in the 50s. After the death of her husband, she embarked on a spiritual journey to cope with her grief, and that theme was apparent in many of her later albums. So Alice Coltrane was born in Detroit in 1937. She started out with an interest in music, which led to her love of jazz. In her early days, she would tour with local jazz bands in Detroit, and then in the 60s she moved to Paris. There she met bebop legend Bud Powell and started taking lessons from him. She also collaborated with greats like Kenny Clarke and Lucky Thompson at the time. Then 1 year later, she returned to Detroit and started touring alongside the Terry Gibbs Band. In 1962, she met her future husband John Coltrane, who took her into his band. Their music was inspired by mutual inspirations and passions. They were both fans of blues and bebop, and their styles were similar to the styles of Charlie Parker and Bud Powell. John Coltrane was one of the pioneers of jazz in the 60s. His influence also inspired Alice Coltrane's playing style. By the 60s, Alice Coltrane's style changed to incorporate wide sweeping cadenzas in her piano playing. She also started taking up harp music. Her music also began to take on a spiritual theme. Then in 1967, John Coltrane died of cancer. In the years following his death, Alice founded a new recording label in his honor, the Coltrane Music Label. Also, she started releasing her own albums, and they all bore hallmarks of her style, blending classic, blues and spiritual themes. She was also one of the pioneers of the harp in jazz music. She would blend it with traditional instruments in her performances. Some of her frequent collaborators at the time included Pharoah Sanders, Charlie Haden, Ornette Coleman and Ron Carter. Her albums were inspired on mystical celestial themes. Some examples included a monastic trio, Huntington Ashram Monastery, Universal Consciousness, World Galaxy, Lord of Lords, Illuminations and Eternity. As she went on producing, she started getting deeply rooted in the spiritual. In 1969, she encountered an Indian guru called Swami Satchidananda. She started studying alongside him. She became familiar with Vedic chants and other spiritual themes that she started incorporating into her music. Her style was similar to many other musicians of the time. There was a tendency for a passion for Eastern spirituality in the music scene. Other musicians who followed that style included George Harrison, Georgia Ann Muldrow and Carlos Santana. In 1972, she made another life-changing decision. She moved to California and started an ashram where she took up duties as a spiritual guru herself. She would conduct services based on Vedic devotional chants, using her musical experience as a catalyst. She'd also produce albums blending traditional classics with Indian themes. Her final album, Translinear Light, was released in 2004. She died in 2007, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most unique and innovative jazz musicians in history. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Alice Coltrane, her life and times and best hits. And now it's time for some trending album news. So there's a new album release around the corner called Live at Montreux Jazz Festival 2023. It's by Iggy Pop and it's due to be released on January 24, 2025. This one's a great live album compilation from Iggy Pop documenting his iconic performance at the 2023 edition of the Montreux Jazz Festival. He performed at last year's festival with his 7-piece band. He took an audience through some of his best hits of all time, like tracks from his time with the band The Stooges, also hit singles from his albums and more. Some of the tracks from the setlist include Lust for Life, The Passenger, Raw Power, Frenzy and more. This was his third time performing at the festival and his performances were filmed by the festival team. You can order the concert album online as Blu-ray plus CD digipack or as a digital download on January 24, 2025. For more information, please visit iggypopmjf.lnk.2/live at MJF 2023. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Alice Coltrane's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Alice Coltrane, her life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about some of her best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour. The first one's called Universal Consciousness. This 1972 album showcases Alice Coltrane's style in all its complexities, her passion of the innovative and also her love for Western and Indian classical music. The album brings out a very spiritual side to her playing also. The music on Universal Consciousness is intense and as explorative as the previous albums. Journey in Sacharinanda was released in 1971. This one's a fascinating, enthralling album with a futuristic theme. The album is characterized by a very ethereal quality, beautiful compositions and a wide range of instrumentals. The album was named after spiritual advisor Swami Sacharinanda. Coltrane explores several uncharted areas in composition, drawing from many cultures and diverse instruments, also is deeply emotional. The next album is called The Elements. This one was released in 1974. Now, the early 70s was a unique time for jazz. There had been new innovations in the previous decade, like free improvisation and jazz fusion, and the future promised unlimited possibilities. So into this landscape entered Joe Henderson. So The Elements was a result of his foray into that landscape. He was joined by other visionaries like Kenneth Nash and Charlie Haydn and Alice Coltrane. And that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Alice Coltrane, her life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about more of her best albums of all time. The first one's called Universal Consciousness. This one was released in 1971. So Alice Coltrane and her husband John Coltrane, another jazz legend, are sometimes synonymous names. She once said during an interview that John Coltrane thought her to look for a universal sound, the art of exploring, to play thoroughly and completely. So that was Alice Coltrane's style, seeking beyond the ordinary for that perfect sound. This style became apparent when Alice was a band member in John's band and she was playing the piano for them. And that sound, an out of the ordinary, almost manic sound, characterized a lot of John Coltrane's music. This 1972 album showcases Alice Coltrane's style in all its complexities, her passion of the innovative and also her love for Western and Indian classical music. The album brings out a very spiritual side to her playing also. Universal Consciousness is in some ways a build-up to similar albums that came before it. Two similar albums, A Monastic Trio and Journey in Sacharinanda. The music on Universal Consciousness is intense and as explorative as the previous albums. The title track is a string, harp and drum instrumental. On Battle of Armageddon, the tension plays out beautifully as rhythmic harp, organ and drum clashes. Hari Krishna was an original composition by Coltrane and it's a beautiful melodic chant that plays out as organ music. Sita Ram, another similar piece with floating harp and organ music. There's also an appearance by the tambura here, that's a type of guitar. Each track in the album seamlessly transitions to the next. The overall effect is that it feels like one long musical recital. The instruments, harp, guitar, drums and so forth beautifully synchronize and complement each other. The album basically encompasses all Coltrane's visions and passions, her musical interests and her spirituality. Journey in Sacharinanda was released in 1971. This one's a fascinating, enthralling album with a futuristic theme. The theme is about divinity. The title track features another jazz legend, Pharoah Sanders. The album is characterized by a very ethereal quality, beautiful compositions and a wide range of instrumentals. Alice Coltrane recorded this in 1970. She dedicated it to her husband John Coltrane, who died 3 years earlier. The album was named after spiritual advisor Swami Sacharinanda. Devastated by her loss, she sought counseling in Sacharinanda. He became her spiritual advisor. So this album is dedicated to Sacharinanda. It's also a narrative of her transformation. Like the title suggests, it's a journey, a spiritual transformation from grief and loss to ultimate renewal. Coltrane explores several uncharted areas in composition, drawing from many cultures and diverse instruments, also is deeply emotional. Her compositions in the album blend bebop influences with her spiritual musical traditions from around the world. The next album is called The Elements. This one was released in 1974. Now, the early 70s was a unique time for jazz. There had been new innovations in the previous decade, like free improvisation and jazz fusion, and the future promised unlimited possibilities. There were electric jazz groups like the Mahavishnu Orchestra that were underway, but avant-garde jazz was taking a backseat. Also, there was a tendency to incorporate non-Western instrumentals into jazz, and these innovations were helped along by people like John Coltrane, his wife Alice, and Pharoah Sanders. So into this landscape entered Joe Henderson. He was a widely famous but relatively traditional saxophonist, and this album was his attempt at more free-flowing impressionistic jazz with a global bent. So The Elements was a result of his foray into that landscape. He was joined by other visionaries like Kenneth Nash and Charlie Haydn and Alice Coltrane. Alice Coltrane herself contributed several instrumentals to the album like the piano, the harp, the tambura and the harmonium. Henderson started out playing in the hard bop genre in the 60s. As the years went by, he started experimenting with other genres like jazz and rock fusion. Albums like The Element, Journey in Sacharinanda and Puta de El Daoud are some examples. So this album is a concept album, one that tells a narrative through the music. There's 4 tracks in the album titled Earth, Water, Air and Fire. Most of the compositions on the album are original works by Henderson. The track Fire is a Latin theme track with percussion instrumentals. Water starts off with the tambura melody. The tambura is a type of guitar by Coltrane. Air is a dynamic piano piece by Coltrane, and then Henderson joins in with the horn solo. Earth combines elements of the previous melodies but also has bass and drum rhythms added. Each piece is unique, but they combine in a beautiful musical narrative. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Alice Coltrane, her life and times and best hits. And now it's time for some trending festival news. Tickets have gone up for sale for the upcoming Montreux Jazz Festival Miami edition, which is set to take place next year. It's taking place in Miami from February 28th to March 2nd. There's a star-studded set list. Here's a quick glimpse into the names on the lineup. 5-time Grammy and Academy Award winner John Batiste. He's also one of the curators of the Miami edition of the festival. There's also singer, songwriter, rapper and actress Janelle Monáe, and rising Cuban star Sima Funk, a 2024 Latin Grammy Record of the Year nominee. The festival is taking place in Regatta Cove, a 1,500 capacity venue, bringing the magic of one of the world's leading jazz festivals to Miami. One highlight from the event is the Montreux Jam session featuring John Batiste and his band Stay Human. There's also a masterclass for VIP ticket holders. The festival cuisine is top-notch and is curated by some of the top chefs in the city. The first edition of the Miami Festival was a massive success and was all about embracing the music and legacy of the city. The second edition of the festival promises just as many great things to Miami's music scene. So tickets went up for sale on October 30th. For more information, please visit www.montreuxjazzfestivalmiami.com/en/. So that was some trending promo news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Alice Coltrane's best albums of all time. Stay tuned.